Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. It's very good to meet some of you and to see some friendly and familiar faces as well. So very good to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation for Paul and I to come and kick off some of your reflections around the cost of living crisis and the broader context of that this afternoon. Our hope is that this session will help you in your thinking about the crisis and in how churches might respond, or rather how churches might continue to respond and the ways in which that might happen. Just to say a few words to locate us, my name's Simeon Mitchell. I've been the United Reformed Church's Secretary for Church and Society for the last 5 years or so. And for the last couple of years, I've held also the role of team leader of the Joint Public Issues team. My colleague Paul is a policy advisor working within the Methodist Church and in the Joint Public Issues team. And for those of you who are not familiar with JPIT is how the Methodist, the Baptist and the United Reformed Churches work together on political engagement and on social witness, along with our associate partner, the Church of Scotland. And of course, we also work in partnership with many others in that work, including many of the other churches that are represented here at different times and in different ways. JPIT was formed about 17 years ago as a pioneering ecumenical experiment, and it seems to have worked, or at least seems to be working so far. And we're a team now of 11 people, including 3 interns working across 3 nations. And we define our purpose in this way. The Joint Public Issues team helps our churches to work together for peace and justice through listening, learning, praying, speaking, and acting on public policy issues. Sometimes we talk about the fact that we face in 2 directions as a team. One is facing towards our churches, where we listen and we learn and we seek to resource local congregations and their local communities to think about the issues in society, and then facing towards those with power, decision makers, and seeking to be a united voice to those too. For several years now, we have framed our work around 6 linked hopes for our society, for our world, hopes that are rooted in kingdom values. Hope for a society that welcomes the stranger, leading us into work particularly around refugees and migration policy. Hope for a planet where the environment is renewed and taking us into climate change and responses to that. Hope, very much linked to that previous one, for a just economy that enables the flourishing of all life. Hope for a world which actively works for peace. Hope for a politics characterized by listening and kindness and truthfulness, and a hope for a society where the poorest and the most marginalized are at the center, reflecting God's priority. And of course, that's the area of work and area of focus which brings us to our topic for today. And we've broken this session into 3 parts. Don't worry, you won't be having to listen to Paul and me continually for the next hour and a half. You will be very relieved to hear, and we're quite relieved too. There's 3 sections. The first is looking at where are we now, trying to orientate ourselves in this current cost of living crisis and looking at the impact it's having and reflecting on how people are responding and what we're hearing through all of that. The second section, Paul is going to come in and help us think about where this crisis has come from, setting this current situation in a broader context, and not to steal Paul's thunder, looking at the decade or more in which poverty in the UK has been getting deeper and more entrenched. And then the third section, where I hope we will have a chance for more conversation together, is about what do the churches have to offer into this situation. We'll be sharing some ideas and hopefully prompting some useful discussions between you as well. So that's the shape of the session. And just to say a word about where we're coming from in JPIT around all this. We've been working on issues of poverty and inequality in the UK for 12 or 15 years now, with a particular focus for many of those years on welfare policy and matters around that. About 3 years ago, at the start of the pandemic, we began a process of intentional listening through interviews, through focus groups, through conversations, working in partnership with the Methodist Church's Church on the Margins programme, which is about listening to the experience of churches and community leaders and those who were battling poverty day by day. And a number of things have come out of that listening exercise. One was, initial thing was a piece of campaigning work focused on the debt that many of those in the poorest communities were forced to take on through no fault of their own, just to make ends meet during the early stages of the pandemic because of their increased living costs. And I know that many churches that are part of CTE were supporters of the Reset the Debt campaign, and thank you for those who were in partnership with us around that. Half of the people who are currently in receipt of universal credit are currently repaying a loan that they were forced to take out at some stage, probably because they applied for universal credit and they had to wait 5 weeks before it started to appear in their bank accounts. So debt is a backdrop to this crisis. And I say that to provide a little bit of context for some of the stories we're about to hear about how the price rises that we've been experiencing for the last year or so are impacting on people. I invite you to listen to these snippets from some audio testimonies.
When you're in debt and you're really struggling, when you've got nothing to begin with, and then something like this cost of living crisis happens, people have got nothing to fall back on because you had nothing. If you've never had anything, you've got no buffer, there's no safety net.
They're telling us that we just need to tighten our purse strings. I mean, in fact, there's nothing in the purse. It's totally empty.
If one thing goes wrong, you just have to do without, and that is when you're in work and you're doing what they say you should be doing, and it's still not enough.
It's not living anymore, is it? It's barely surviving.
That's the thing, just constantly keep an eye on what money you've got, just in case you're going to run out.
Treading water.
And this is also saying either eating or eating. You have to choose one.
That's been my mantra for a long time. But no, it isn't a choice between heating or eating, because you can't afford to do any. We're lucky if we get one hot meal a week, me and the husband, because we insist on feeding the kids first, because that's what you do as a parent. Where does it stop? What else do we cut out of our lives just to keep your kids fed?
Yeah, I think most people in the situation we're in, we've made as many cutbacks as we can now. There's just nothing else left to do to try and sort of save some money.
For some of you, those will be realities that you're very familiar with. For those of us who are not, I think they give a little insight into what it's like to be at the sharp end of the cost of living crisis. Because none of us here will have been unaware of or unaffected by the rises in the cost of living over the last year or so. Increasing prices have had impacts across the whole of our society. But the sharpest and the most immediate impacts are being felt by those who are least well off, and who are least well off to start with. One reason for that is that inflation rates are higher for the poorest families. The effective inflation rate for those who are on the lowest incomes is conservatively estimated at 12.5% for the year to April. That's a few percentage points higher than for people in general. The main driver of inflation is increasing household energy costs, and that's been accompanied by large food price rises over the last year. 13% overall, but more for the cheaper foods. The poorest families, by necessity, spend a higher proportion of their incomes on food and on fuel than the average family. So that means that higher inflation rate for the poorest plays out. A second reason why the poorest are being impacted most by this is, of course, they simply don't have anything to fall back on, and you got a flavour of some of that from those audio diaries. Analysis undertaken by Professor Donald Hirsch of Loughborough University last autumn, which was commissioned by Gordon Brown, the former Prime Minister, and published by JPIT, and with the endorsement of a number of the churches who are here, highlighted that for an average family of 4 who are in receipt of benefits, even taking into account the additional payments and the caps on energy prices, people will be around £1,400 worse off this year than last. That's a shortfall of over £115 a month. And as a result, people have faced awful choices. You heard about some of them there. Around half of adults in receipt of universal credit now say they regularly skip meals because they can't afford them. Half of adults on universal credit. No wonder that frontline staff working for Action for Children, the children's charity, recently reported that child poverty levels were at the worst they could ever remember. You can see from this graph that poverty particularly affects working age adults and therefore children. And the older demographic is a relatively small proportion of those in poverty in the UK at the moment. But a third of those in poverty are children. If we break down those figures by other characteristics, we build up an even clearer a picture of the face of poverty. You might struggle to see some of those, but the dotted line across the middle is the average level of poverty, and then this identifies some groups who have much higher proportional levels of poverty. You're much more likely to be on a low income if you're from an ethnic minority, if you have a disability, if you're a single parent, and if you have young children. The evidence suggests that 1.3 million more people will have been plunged into poverty over the course of this winter, including 500,000 children. So what do we do? What are we doing in response to this? Churches and community groups have been responding to the needs created by this current crisis with extraordinary energy and extraordinary generosity, despite facing many challenges themselves, which you'll all be familiar with. Thousands of warm welcomes offering heated, hospitable spaces to those who want them opened across the country this winter. Food banks are the busiest they've ever been. I think we saw in the paper that the Trussell Trust have provided that there's been a 40% year-on-year rise in demand for food banks when their latest figures came out. Debt counselling centres have been working with unprecedented numbers of clients, and all this has gone alongside the ongoing work of churches in the communities that they serve. But those community responses, brilliant as they are coming under increasing strain. Some of you will have seen the recent report from Theos, which looked into this in more detail and identified the shortage of donations, the tired volunteer base, the rising costs that many of those projects were facing. And it might be good to have some feedback from some of you on that and how it feels where you are in a moment. But first, we just wanted to briefly look at the outlook for the next year or two. This last year, 2022, saw the largest annual drop in the average living standards in the UK since the Second World War. Disposable income fell on average by 3.3%. This year, it's expected to be an even larger fall. And in the budget last week, those figures were confirmed. Inflation, as we know, is still sky high, although that is expected to drop significantly over the course of the year. But average living standards aren't expected to stop falling at least until the end of this year. And a recovery to pre-pandemic levels or even pre-2008 banking crisis levels are not expected for many years. So that's the averages, but our economy is quite an unequal economy. So those averages disguise some important other trends. Those with the lowest incomes are expected to see a longer and a deeper impact on their standard of living than the average family, whereas the wealthiest 10 or 15% are expected to see their overall incomes rise this year, driven by higher interest rates, which generate greater investment income. I've already mentioned the Resolution Foundation's prediction that 1.3 million more people will have fallen into poverty during this winter. So in summary, as we look ahead, things will get worse before they might start to get better. for some people.
So the sort of second section we wanted to talk about, oh, don't kick the bucket. The second section we wanted to talk about was, where has this come from? And Simeon mentioned that that we did these sort of focus groups and conversations around the country. And one of the first things that was said was that for us who are on low income, the cost of living crisis started 5-10 years ago. The cost of living crisis was not something that occurred because of the pandemic, and was not something that occurred because of the inflation that's come after the pandemic. And when you look at the numbers, and you can draw out the standards of living of different groups in society and people on different incomes, you see very clearly that at this point in time, the sort of drops in standard of living of the average person, of the median family in the UK, which everyone feels and is hurting and is causing most of us to look through our budgets, that was the reality for people on the lowest incomes 5 years ago. So that this cost of living crisis is not created by a pandemic, it's just been expedited and reinforced and pushed further up the income spectrum since the pandemic. And I want to tell you two stories. One that I think will surprise you a great deal, and another which I don't think will at all. And I'll start with the surprising story. And I don't know whether you get this. This is just a graph of household wealth in the United Kingdom, starting in 2010, moving all the way across to 2018, which is the last time we've got this data for, so before the pandemic. If you just take everyone as an average, household wealth started the decade at £200,000 per household in the UK. And it ended the decade at £300,000 per household in the UK. But as you see from that, as you see from the graph, at that top line, the top tenth of earners, the wealthiest 10%, most of that increase in wealth went to them. The middle group, the median earners, go from about 180,000 to about 235,000, so still a substantial increase. And for the lowest 10%, it stays around 5,000, and the variation is within the margin of error of the study. So what you have over that decade is the middle growing slowly, the top growing very fast, and the bottom staying at the bottom and flatlining. And I've picked on the last decade because it's the last decade. But if you look at the decade before, you see a slightly less extreme, but a similar trend. And I can draw that graph, and if you're not careful, I will draw that graph and show you. For income, says much the same thing. So the average wages stayed flat, but the average income went up. And the difference between wages and income is investments, unearned income. So when you add that in, average wages went up. When you look at the United Kingdom, the amount of food we ate per person went up. The quality of that food increased. Our calorific intake increased up until 2017, and then flatlined largely because we started buying healthier food. The number of houses, the number of bedrooms per person in the United Kingdom increased during the last decade. The stock market increased by about 25% during the last decade. Almost any measure of increase of wealth throughout the society increased over the last decade. And at the same time, I'm going to tell you the story that you probably expect me to tell you. And I've got two graphs here. The line graph is the number of people fed by Trussell Trust food banks, or the number of parcels given out, more accurately. for Trussell Trust food banks over the past decade. It starts at around 30,000. That big peak is the pandemic at about 2.5 million. We are going to break 2.5 million this year. So this is the busiest time that food banks in the UK have ever had. The second graph is, some people have said that the reason why there are more people getting food parcels is because there are just more food banks and they're more available. So Joseph Rowntree Foundation, they asked the British public, what does destitution mean? What does it mean to you? And they did focus groups and they did some polling, and then they put together a definition, and then they went out and measured how much destitution there was in the UK using that definition, And in 2015, there was 1.25 million experiencing destitution. 2017, 1.5 million. By 2019, before the pandemic, there was 2.4 million. So that poverty, this version of poverty that we thought we had eliminated in this country, this deep poverty that is difficult to get out of because we have data on how long the duration of people in poverty has increased. At the same time as our nation as a whole and per person became wealthier, the poorest became hungrier and less able to keep a roof over their head and less able to wash themselves, because that's one of the things in destitution, in the destitution measure. And we have to hold those two stories together and ask ourselves why that is. And I think the other thing I wanted to say about that is, in 2013, in the poorest areas of our country, life expectancy started to fall. You may hear those of you approaching retirement, or wishing they were approaching retirement at my age, in my case, may have welcomed the news that the expected raise in the retirement age has been postponed. The reason for that is that life expectancy is no longer increasing. That starts in 2013 in the poorest areas and goes for median families just after the pandemic. So there may be some of the pandemic may be feeding into that. But it's absolutely clear, and you can see it from other health data, that people's well-being and their duration of life and their health started to deteriorate again as the nation was getting wealthier. And that sort of brings me to the last thing I wanted to say in this bit, which is, if you hold those two stories together, you have to ask, what is the reason? Why is this the case? And there are two explanations, and you don't have to hold both of them 100%. But largely there is an explanation which is structural, which says that the structures of society are causing this. Or there is an explanation that says this is personal, that poverty is caused by people's own failings. I believe that 10 years ago, just after the banking crisis, the Joint Public Issues team put out a report called The Lies We Tell Ourselves, which showed how the personal narrative was being pushed by saying that it was the fault of the lazy, feckless poor that there is so much poverty. And I do not believe that. Clearly the evidence that was put forward then and the evidence that is being put forward now for that case is wrong. It is just not true. But what tends to happen? What tends to happen after a big economic crisis is that sympathy for the poor increases. We saw that. You can go back all the way to the the Poor Law Reform Act of 1834. At the start, when people are appearing hungry, there is sympathy. And very quickly, when their hunger starts to translate into us needing to have less, or government action, or expensive actions, very quickly it moves into talking about the individual And very quickly it moves into, and there is a government narrative that moves it towards saying this is about individuals and we need to help them and leave those structures aside. And I say that because you can already see that turn happening. And that in a year or two's time, we will all be talking about individuals, or that is what the press wants to talk about. And I think that we should not be led there. And I used to say that it was just about bad people, producing these bad reports that are blaming. But I wanted to finish with, when I come home from a food bank and I've sat with someone and they've told me their story, and I go to my fridge and I open it up, I feel awful. I feel terrible. Why do I deserve to have this choice of things? Why do I deserve to afford to have that thing going moldy at the back when the person I talk to has nothing? And the reason why that story of personal gets so much traction is we want to believe it. All of us, I think, want to believe it, because it would be a better world if that person who couldn't eat, there was something wrong with them, and I'm okay. And I think we need to live with that and think about that. So I thought, well, one, I think we've all realized I am the full nerd. I am the full policy wonk, and I'm unashamed of it. And I thought the best way to sort of go through this, and the best way to sort of to show what we mean about what changes could be done, is to use a worked example. And the worked example I know most is universal credit, which is part of the benefit system. Okay. So I just want to set the scene and explain what universal credit is. So there used to be a large number of different benefits, for separate benefits for people who had disability, people who were unemployed, people who were in low income, and people with caring responsibilities. And they were all merged together into this one thing called universal credit. So you get these 6 benefits, especially housing benefit, which is actually more than all the other benefits put together, are shoved into one thing, and it's called universal credit. And that happens in 10 years ago. Actually, the first universal credit claim was 10 years ago on the 1st of April. April Fool's Day, which seems strangely appropriate. So one of the things people think about with the benefit system is that the benefit system is about unemployment. It's people who are not in work. That's absolutely not the case. Around half the people on universal credit, when it's fully rolled out, will be working but with a low income. The next largest group are people with health issues, and then about 10% will be of caring responsibilities and 10% unemployment. And the 10% unemployment are the most transient group in that. So most of the people who are unemployed stay unemployed for less than 13 weeks and then move on to another job. Often staying on universal credit, being working with a low income, often working and still staying in poverty. But they're not unemployed. So this is a benefit designed for people just with low incomes. And the question is, why do you want to shove them all together into one thing? Why do you want to treat them all as one? And the answer is this. And if you're a particular sort of economist, this graph is indecently beautiful. This graph is just wonderful. On the grounds that you give people money, and then when they earn something, you essentially tax their earnings. So you take 55p for every pound they earn. And if you're a particular type of economist, you say, well, if I'm a rational, self-interested economic actor, what I will do is I will choose to work more because it will always be in my interests to work more. And that will increase the number of people accepting jobs, and therefore we will have more employment. I can cut to the end of the story and say, it does not work. We've had 10 years of it, and it does not get more people into employment. And I can tell you that because the DWP were foolish enough to put it into an advertisement to say that universal credit gets more people into work. And that advertisement was found to be unsubstantiated, misleading, and inaccurate. But other than that, fine. So if you're that particular type of economist, you need to rethink your assumptions because it did not work. But the thing that it did do was increase food bank use. This is quite an old slide from work we did with Sky News around universal credit rollout. So comparing food banks in areas where universal credit hadn't been rolled out with areas where universal credit had been rolled out, you had 52% increase in areas where you got universal credit and 13% increase in areas where you didn't get universal credit. And the first thing, and the thing that I think everybody around this room knows, is that the first thing churches do is we give out food. This is a policy failure, this is a problem, and our first response and our immediate response is to see to that immediate need. And I want to go on to other responses, but I don't want to say that that's lesser or not good. That's a fantastic thing. Millions of people, literally millions of people, would be in a much worse place had churches not stood up to do that. And that's really important. But I think I want to argue it's not enough. I want to argue that if we are involved in mass feeding of the population, there is a structural injustice going on, and we're in danger of facilitating it. So this is from today, or this is actually from September's numbers. 53.8% of universal credit claimants, the adults in those families, regularly skipped meals because they could not afford them. And I think for most of us here, you would say, that means universal credit is a failure. That means it has failed in what it's meant to do. But that is not the case. And I can sort of explain why. Okay, are you ready to go full nerd? This slide comes from a 2014 document on the what's it called? The theory of change behind universal credit. And I think me and 2 other people have read it. So here is the universal credit theory of change. You aren't going to be able to read that. But this is the worked out example of what it is you want universal credit to do and what you do, how it is going to change the world to achieve the outcomes you want. So you've got those 3 blue slides, and they're the main points. And I'll move on. And this is just a summary of them. The bottom slide says, policy levers shape delivery. Effective delivery leads to attitude and behavior change. Changes in attitudes and behaviors leads to better labour market outcomes. There are 2 things you should notice from that. The first is that if you believe that poverty is individual, that works for you. That works really well. There is an assumption that people, and remember, the majority of the people being affected by this policy are in work. And the next largest group are too sick to work. Effective delivery leads to attitude and behavior change. That is what the system is seeking to do. Success is if, and they even went out and measured it. Yeah, that's what you do with the theory of change. You then try to measure the things that you're trying to change. So they went out and measured people's attitudes to behavior. And the reason I can say that hunger isn't viewed as a failure is they didn't go out and measure that. Those numbers I showed you were from the Food Foundation, who measured it separately. They're a charity. DWP has never measured hunger amongst universal credit claimants because it was not part of what it was trying to do. But the assumption that is embedded there is that people need their behaviours and their attitude changed. And I'm not sure that assumption's safe. And as I've said, even if it did change behaviours and attitude, it did not change labour market outcomes. That is absolutely clear. So there's one thing. The next thing I would suggest that the churches should be part of and should do is that this is a fantastic campaign, which I assume the person from Trussell Trust is going to talk about tomorrow. So I'll take the role of John the Baptist and say, this is fantastic. It is saying that that principle that I think we all thought was embedded in the benefit system, that people should have enough to avoid destitution, that the system should provide enough to avoid destitution, they want that embedded in the system now. So to say something that our values and our ethos and what we know of God tells us that no one should experience destitution, and that should be embedded in the policies of our nation wherever possible. So that's what that campaign is about, Guarantee Our Essentials, or the Essentials Guarantee. One of the things that JPIT is doing at the moment is trying to scare a group of, I think the word scare is inappropriate there, trying to gather a group of civil society organisations, including unions, faith groups, local charities, national charities, to talk about the moral case to end poverty. Because Guarantee Our Essentials, to make that policy a reality, you have to genuinely believe that destitution and poverty are wrong and should be removed from our society. And you have to believe that enough to prioritise that over any number of things that are happening within our society and any number of things that are calling for resource. So we are trying to get together this group to make that moral case to say this is important and this should be a priority, whoever is in government, whenever they are in government. And the last thing, if you're that sort of economist, I thought I'd give that to you as a treat. If you're not that sort of economist, I wanted to end by saying the last thing that we should be doing. And it's probably the hardest, but I think it's possibly the most important. Inside that graph is embedded a whole host of assumptions about what a good life is and what people are. Inside that graph, it says that we are rational, self-interested beings. And I think our faith, for 2,000 years, we've been trying to work out what we are, but I think rational, self-interested beings is a vastly oversimplified idea. Inside that graph, there is assumptions about how we interact as individuals. And again, given that it didn't work, we might wish to think about it. And what I'm trying to argue is that inside the graphs that you will see economists produce are assumptions about ideas that the church has been discussing for millennia. It's just put in a different form that we don't interact with very well. The thing is that those sort of assumptions are coming unraveled. Since 2008, they have looked shakier and shakier. And post-pandemic, they've looked shakier and shakier and shakier. And people are casting around for a new idea. And people are casting around for a new way of growing our economy or having an economy or any of those things. And if the churches are not inputting that knowledge we have had for thousands of years, I think society would be worse off because of it. That knowing that we are, yes, sometimes selfish, but often altruistic. Knowing that, yes, we group together and we act as groups and sometimes we act as individuals. And that nuance and that richness of knowledge that exists in all of our churches and exists in our theology is really important as we move forward and will be really important over the next decade. And I just wanted to say, today, the day the Bank of England put up interest rates. Now, you may not know that the quantitative easing program was when inflation went down low, what we did was we printed money in a hope to increase inflation to 2% level, which we've decided is good. The way we printed money inflated the value of assets that existed, which means if you owned stuff, you became richer. The Bank of England estimates that the top 10% of households became over £250,000 richer in assets because of that government policy. Today, we increased inflation. Inflation is too high, so we increased interest rates. That is the standard response. What that does is people with assets get more money on their assets. If the assumptions in the system say that whatever the problem is, the answer is to push money in one direction and away from another group of people, maybe we need to revisit those assumptions.